Welcome, everyone, and we're back for another session of Productivity Power Hour. And today I thought we'd try out a slightly different format where rather than talk about a specific app or tool, we talk about ideas revolving around productivity. Because I think as much as we like to focus on tooling and stuff to sort of make us more productive and such, the reality is I think our perspective on things often can serve as really the biggest drivers when it comes to what we end up producing in our lives. And so in our last session, we talked a lot about growth and fixed mindset. I think this will probably come up a little bit today as well. But so for today, the topic I wanted to talk about is around the idea of metrics and success. And it's something that comes up a lot, especially when it comes to our careers and often how we often evaluate ourselves as individuals. And so, yeah, I thought I'd open up a discussion for, obviously people in the chat to chime in as far as their own thoughts on this. And then in the meantime, I thought I would share my experience with this. And yeah, we can kind of go from there. So with that, let's go ahead and kick it off. Let's talk about metrics and success. That's what we're here to talk about today. And so I'm going to go ahead and open up Obsidian because this is where we want to start taking notes on this, right? And so the real question here is the question I'm trying to ask here, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm actually open the productivity note I have for today. And let's just start with this question here about metrics that people care about. Because this is a really interesting thing as far as, well, let's face it, when we're trying to be productive, a lot of times what drives us forward are certain things that basically what we're measured on. And for those of us growing up in sort of more traditional schooling, this is a really big piece of our lives. In fact, we're very strongly ingrained to care about these things. So, I mean, just in talking about that, the primary let's see. So the primary metric we encounter when growing up are grades, right? We get graded on our schoolwork. We get graded on the tests. We get graded on how we're doing. And we often use these metrics as a way of deciding sort of our own worth, unfortunately, to whether for better or for, well, I would say honestly, oftentimes for worse. So as a result, we get this, how do I put it, like a classification system. We started thinking of ourselves as either really smart, really dumb, or really good at something and really not. When if we think about metrics, a lot of times they're really just snapshots. And this is similar to what we were talking about before regarding the growth and fixed mindset. However, unfortunately, because metrics are such a big part of our society, this is what I really want to try to unwrap today. So, okay. So, and people here in the chat, I'm curious, what metrics when it comes to your job do you find people basically often find great, or well, let me put it this way. So for people in the chat, what do you think as far as metrics when it comes to your own lives, right? What have you found that people are measuring you by, or you're measuring yourself by? And so, I'll let you all think about that. And for those throwing it in the chat, let's think of I'll think about some things from my own experience. So for example, as a developer, I've heard metrics tossed around in various ways, right? For example, we could talk about number of lines of code committed. Yes, that is a thing. There are companies who actually will look at someone's contributions to a code base. And so number of commits is a great one. This is from GitHub, the contribution graph. That's one that constantly gets referred to. Oh, there you go. Abelai here. Resolve tickets. Perfect. Yeah. So how many tickets have you actually resolved? And so what's funny about that, even within tickets, it's like, how many bugs did you create? Right? Or is it how many bugs did you resolve? And so, yeah, I already see E. Runyon here about lines of code committed sounds like a terrible metric. And you're right. And I think you're definitely hinting at or moving towards exactly what I'm want to get at in this is thinking about really where metrics become a toxic element of productivity rather than something that's beneficial. Because as we can see here, as we're starting to rack this stuff up, some of these look pretty arbitrary. So I see here radio signal here. Keep to the time window, right? So amount of time spent on the ticket, right? And it's weird because when we start focusing on these very specific metrics, we find ourselves ultimately gaming the system. So for example, imagine if a developer is being evaluated against how many bugs they solve. Well, to be honest, if that's something that's a positive on their review, this gives them less reason to then write less buggy code. Because then the people who write good code who aren't solving bugs look like they're not doing anything. And if you're wondering, again, these are a lot of things I'm talking about are from real world scenarios that I've actually heard people have to deal with as far as like performance evaluation. And so again, amount of time spent on a ticket is a tricky one as well, because it might seem like a good one. However, I think for those of us who have been working in the industry for a while, you'll know that tickets come in various sizes. So whatever problem you're trying to solve, from, oh, by the way, the border radius on this button is really like it's maybe it's not rounded enough. You and I probably know that that's like a 2-line change, probably might take 30 minutes to an hour if you do some like testing and stuff, but otherwise fairly simple. But if something complicated, like, oh, by the way, the layout on the page is broken, like that could take hours, if not days sometimes, to figure out what exactly is going on. And so this is kind of a tricky thing, right? And so what other things? So for those who are like writers or let's say content producers, right? Number of pieces published is an easy one, where you're like, oh, well, I published 3 videos this week, right? And 3 videos, what does that mean? Does that mean 2 5-minute videos? Does that mean an hour-long videos? And how much research went into that? So, and then, number of words written per, blog posts. And so let me think, what other things do we care about? Yes. I love how I skipped over this one, but honestly, this is the one that's a little bit more universal. Money. A lot of us, when it comes to thinking about productivity and whether or not something is worth doing, decide based on how much money we're being paid. Ooh, Josh here, number of viewers. Yeah, that's great. Number of viewers. Views or views for content. That is absolutely great. AJ Truex here. Yep, money. Yep. So actually, I want to speak a little bit to the viewers. It's kind of interesting, right? Because if your goal is basically based on view count. So if you look at the ad industry in general, right, or the news industry, a lot of them, because they chose the route of being financially supported through ads, had to optimize their strategy for clicks. Clicks meaning how many people actually looked at it, how many people were willing to engage on it, right? Yeah, I see here with followers, subscribers. These are great. And so the problem, though, we found, though, is what do we end up with, right? We ended up with clickbaity things, because if your job is contingent on how many people click on it, you're going to try to find the most like clickbaity thing you can to bring people in, even if the article may not have a lot of substance. And as a result, you find yourself in a tricky position between compromising the kind of stories you probably want to tell versus what outcome that is, call it artificially manufactured as a result of being really focused on said metric. And so to the topic of money, right? Money comes in all different sorts of form. I mean, we can call it money / like material goods, really. And so these metrics, oftentimes we use them as status symbols. We're talking about what? Job salaries are an easy one, right? Where we think, well, if I'm being paid $50,000 for this and I find out someone else is being paid $100,000 for the same job, does this make me like worth half as much as them? And this is a tricky thing, because as the industry, especially within tech, is trying to figure out how to ensure like fair pay practices, because again, it's a complicated topic in terms of pay transparency and all these things. But I see I see Prince here in the chat. But the interesting thing about job salaries, right, especially when we come to tech, is what I've seen is when we think of our value, right, according to what we're being paid, this is a very dangerous place to be, because what we end up finding ourselves is chasing this sort of basically like never ending carrot, like the carrot on the stick metaphor that people often use. And this is a part of what inspired me to talk about this and just think about this sort of with y'all when it comes to productivity, because these metrics, like money, oftentimes distract ourselves from, I think, what's really important. So for now, we talk about job salaries. We can talk about, like tech gadgets, whatever. Like these are things that are brand names, actually brand name products, right? These are things that people often use to elevate their feelings of success and of importance. So buying a fancy car and all those things. So we talked about some high level metrics regarding like what people often tend to focus on when they're evaluating like whether or not what they're doing is worth doing. So let's ask the next question here regarding success, right? Because metrics are numbers that we can focus on to skew statistics or however we want to use them. We can manipulate them to our liking. But the question is how does metrics then relate to the concept of success? So again, in the chat, please feel free to throw in like, when you think about success, what does success mean to you? And so in the meantime, I'll jot down some, let's call it like common definitions of success. So high paying job, right? And so that varies for, I call it like different industries and people with different lifestyles, but usually pay, as we talked about, money is associated with it. Let's see, high ranking titles. That's a big deal. It's why a lot of people aim to, as the saying goes, like climb the corporate ladder, because over time, if you can say that you're a director, if you can say you're a VP, these are things that people define as success. I see Pickle Light Bright here. Thanks for chatting, or thanks for chiming in here. Being able to buy brand name chips even when guests aren't coming over. I mean, that's fair, right? Being able to afford nice things, yeah, regardless of whether people can appreciate it. Right? There's this concept of being able to afford those things. Prince here. Let's see. Oh, I see Josh here. Ability to work on things that we like. Ooh, okay. I like where this is going. Ability to work on things that we like. Prince here. More responsibilities. Yup. Responsibilities. More power. Yeah. And control. It's a double-edged sword. Power and control. I know it has its negative connotations. Jacob here, making decisions based on my happiness and not based on finances or job requirements. Yeah, so I'm going to file that on the ability to work on things we like, right? Making decisions based on happiness and not on other arbitrary metrics. Okay. Yep. So Pickle Light right here clarifying. Okay, let's see. Moving forward, nice things. So I guess let's call this having a comfortable life. You're totally right, right? For some people, that's being able to go out all the time, right? They never have to cook again. They can go to restaurants and have chefs, cook for them, and then they have someone come in to clean, and they have a really comfortable life. That could be a measure of success as well. Scheduling that is conducive to work-life balance. Yeah, this is great. Scheduling that's conducive to work-life balance. And so I'd also say, like, for me, another avenue of success is being able to spend the time with people that bring you joy and happiness, right? And so being able to spend time or work with people who bring you happiness, because you can have a lot of those things, but that doesn't necessarily mean you work on a team in which you enjoy each other's company, or more importantly, like the people you're around. If there are people that unfortunately bring you down, I wouldn't call that necessarily success, right? AJ Truex here. Social impact. Some weirdos want to make a difference. Social impact. Yeah. And you know what? I think AJ Truex hits on... I think this is exactly it, right? This is the word that I want to try to unwrap a little bit more as we go through this stream and then sort of think through some things. Is that ultimately, if we think about success and metrics, what we really want is the ability to create impact. And so let's move on to the next question, right? So we have some high level notes here. So how does success ultimately dictate metrics? So when it comes to success and metrics, right? We've talked a little bit before about, actually, I'll go ahead. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to open this one in a pane, open this one up in a separate pane. So this should allow us to compare the two. Okay. So we can see here, right, when we're talking about success and metrics, we end up with this, well, we see like lines of code here committed as a developer, which often can translate to being able to be promoted, right? This is where the relationship often happens, because based on what your criteria is for being successful, or what society dictates, they think success means for you, oftentimes we'll find ourselves being guided by specific metrics. And so again, so we say, how does success differ metrics, right? Promotion dictates what actions you must take to obtain their version of success. And this is a little bit pessimistic, I think, as a definition. But if you think about it, when you want to get a promotion within your company, one of the things you're doing is you are basically agreeing to a set of standards they've defined, and then the actions in which you must take in order to meet what they consider important. So this is what I was saying regarding metrics, right? And to be very clear, this is a double-edged sword. It's not a right or wrong thing, because there are companies that are structured really well so that if you meet the right metrics, you actually are growing as an individual. Whereas other companies, when they're working on career ladders and that kind of thing, are actually more designed to just simply promote their agenda, and they really could care less about whether you as an individual are growing. And so this is what I was talking about regarding promotions then, because if as a developer, your impact is like, as far as the company decides for your promotion, is around the amount of code that you've committed, or how late, how responsive you are, even though like you're off hours and there's a bug that you respond immediately. If your company starts to value those things, you end up dictating, and well, not even dictating, you end up catering your life in order to serve that particular mission. Because your whole idea here is, like, again, if we're talking about movement in life and making movement towards something, oftentimes we use these goalposts of success as ways to like guide us. But as we kind of see in our discussion here, that guidepost can often mislead us in the wrong direction, especially when it's set by someone else. And this is what I think is rather scary about the way metrics are used to manipulate people, because call it what it is, right? Like, if you're in school and you've learned to optimize a learning path to get the best grade, the funny thing about grades being the metric of like success of school is that doesn't necessarily mean you learned a lot. That didn't mean you took away knowledge that could really be applicable. It just meant you managed to figure out the system in a way that allowed you to basically get the grade that made you look good. And I think that's what's tricky, right? So let me make a note about this. So grades does not equate to learning. Because we see this, I think, a lot as a lot of us go through our careers as well. As people progress and grow, they find themselves in a position where if they're either in leadership roles or growing to be in leadership roles, you have a decision point where you have to decide between, well, am I going to simply just keep climbing the career ladder? Because if your definition of success as someone climbing the career ladder is to keep going to the next level of promotion, you might end up making decisions that ultimately aren't in the benefit of your employees, of your team members, of the people who have basically been entrusted to your care. Because what are you doing? You're choosing to maintain your public image in favor. Well, yeah, you're choosing to maintain your public image in favor of your success over the needs of everyone else, right? And we see this countless times, unfortunately, with managers, and it's a sad fact. And so we've talked about success, we've talked about metrics, and how success can often dictate those metrics. Now we're going to sort of return now to this point that AJ Truex here had mentioned here in the chat, which is really impact. Because it's funny, a lot of times when people think about success, I think they think of impact like hand in hand. But I would argue that oftentimes it's not, right? Because if success is often driven by your metrics, you're probably not actually thinking about impact a lot of times, because you're often acutely aware of how you might move towards a very specific goal, but not in terms of broader chain reactions. And so, I see here Pickle Light Bright in the chat. So let's see. You know what I'm going to do actually real quick? Let's go ahead and switch up. No, it's fine. So this has such a heavy impact on so many people. And as soon as the assignment exam is done, 90% of the time, once it's out of your hands, it is no longer consequential. In real life, this doesn't translate, and it's so hard to make that shift from school onwards when this has been drilled into us our whole lives. Oof. Pickle Light Bright, I'm not sure I really could have said that any better. This is one of the things, after sort of leaving like the traditional schooling sort of system, this is something that I really honestly have been thinking a lot about. And so hence why we're here today. Okay. And so we're talking about impact. And if impact here is different from success, how can we ultimately define impact? And I'm curious what some people think in the chat. I'll start by throwing something out there, which is I would say impact has a lot to do with the values that you have in life. And this is a really tricky one because if we think about values, oftentimes our values start, call it prescribed by our environment. So, what your parents taught you growing up, or again, if you grew up in a certain part of the world, there are different cultural things that often help to shape, I'll call it the foundation of your values. I don't want to say define because when we talk about defining values, if it kind of reminds me of the fixed mindset mentality because values can be formed, shaped, and they can be changed. It might be hard. It might be really hard to do so. But I think a lot of times when we talk about value definition, I think it gives me that feeling of like making something concrete and set in stone when I believe these things can be changed. Yet, because a lot of times we're sort of reliant on society to define these things for us, or I wouldn't say we're relying on it. It's kind of how it's been designed, right? Here are a set of rules and values that will most likely help you survive and succeed in life. But this is very different from values that you often end up choosing for yourself. And I'm not sure a lot of us are given the opportunity early on to really spend the time to really do that for ourselves. And as a result, it makes it, I think, really tricky for us as adults because similar to Pickle Lightbright's comment, is that once you've left this system that has basically been really prescriptive regarding what's important, right? Regarding your grades, regarding what you learn, regarding how you approach life, what is it like suddenly to navigate like you've spent what 12, let's see, assuming you're in school for kindergarten to 12th grade, that's 12 years. So for the first like 17 18 years of your life, you've been more or less had your thoughts prescribed by someone else. So how do you navigate that suddenly on your own? And I think this is one of the trickiest things about it. So I see here AJ Truex commenting here on Pickle Lightbright. So not to mention, when majoring in a tech career, 90% of the curriculum is out of date. And so, right, because if you're waiting for someone else to tell you what's relevant, then again, you're at their whim. If they happen to be really structured and like it's designed really well, then like you're in the clear. But in the event they're wrong, it's kind of interesting. You've put so much trust in a system that does not necessarily guarantee that they're going to look out for your own best interests. Right? And that's one of the things that I really want to try to explore more through this series on Productivity Power Hour is how we can really come into our own self. Because I think that's where the most interesting innovation and contributions to community are, is when people realize that even though society has probably spent a lot of time telling us that we're sort of these binary things of the things that we are often designated by. So for example, if you are an athlete, right? Here's a common one. If you're an athlete, then there's no way you like academic things. Or if you're an academic, there's no way you like sporty things, right? Granted, the cultural shifts are starting to change on this a bit, but it's this kind of thinking though that often holds, I think, a lot of us back. And so, in the tech industry, we talk a lot about imposter syndrome and that kind of thing. And it's because I think we think that there's some sort of grade in which we get this like stamp of approval that like we are officially now a qualified developer and we never have to prove ourselves ever again. When the only proof we need doing is aligning ourselves to whether we're creating the kind of impact that we want each day, every day, right? And so working out is a great example actually of this, right? Maintaining your health is not some sort of fixed point where like, oh, if I can run a mile, I never need to run again because my health is like going to be in pristine condition after I'm able to run a mile. We all know that health is something that's ongoing, that's something you need to upkeep. And so similarly, when we're making the progress as individuals to creating impact and aligning ourselves to value, this is work that is just, how do I put this? It's an ongoing process. And I think if we see it as a lifelong journey rather than like an end result, I think it takes off a lot of the burden to like rush to a certain endpoint, because otherwise you get this feeling of, Well, for those who like musicals, for example, or actually, it doesn't matter if you like musicals. One of the musicals I saw recently was called Tick Tick Boom, and for those you probably know I wouldn't say composer, but he helped like do the music and everything. Producer Lin Manuel, who did things like Moana, most recently Encanto, very very popular, and so he did like Hamilton, and so anyways, this play is talking about this guy named Jonathan Larson who wrote Rent, which is one of the really famous Broadway musicals. And the reason I'm telling you this is because he spent a lot of his time, at least according to like sort of the musical, which is Tick Tick Boom, which is kind of like an autobiography of his life. He spent a lot of time comparing himself to other great musical theater writers who had created all these wonderful works of art by a certain age. And I think when we think of life that way, it's honestly disheartening because we think that somehow like our path is the same as everyone else's, when in fact we come with such different backgrounds. And as a result, it's kind of like saying, for those who've done any cooking, just because you get like, if you're really trying to optimize the flavor of a dish and really bring out its unique flavors, right? If you've ever squeezed any lemons or limes and use it in a recipe, you'll probably know that not all limes and lemons are created equal. After all, like they often have different levels of acidity, and there's like, when you squeeze the juice, different amount of juice comes out of each lemon. And so by tailoring your dish, you have to like, each time you have to ascertain the differences, and that's what allows you to really bring out the most flavor of things, right? Otherwise, if you're just arbitrarily like, oh yeah, every dish needs 2 lemons, you're going to find inconsistency in your results. So let's see. Okay, I missed some stuff in the chat here. Let's see. Academic solid. Prince. I'm not sure what that comment was to Prince, but anyway, let's see. Iranian. Okay. So I have been a professional web developer for over 24 years, and I still get imposter syndrome from time to time. Yeah. And so imposter syndrome is a tricky one, right? Because as we sort of mentioned earlier, it is this sort of idea around there's somehow at some point you would be fully qualified to be something. And so there's actually this, I'll call it a fable, is what I'll call it. I believe it's called Chop Wood, Carry Water. Yeah. And this book I read, so it's the premise of the book is fairly simple. It's this idea that a lot of times we forget that becoming the person we want to become is a process, and a lifelong one at that. So actually, on top of, since I have this up, I'm actually going to go ahead and drop this in resources because I have read this one. I would recommend it for those who kind of looking for a sort of story-like way of reinforcing this concept of what it means to, be great. And so it's funny we're talking about greatness because that's often connected to success. And if we look at the greats and the master artists of the world that we live in, each one of those like kept honing their craft each and every day. There was no end result. And so a great example of this is, if you love sushi and you haven't seen this one, this is a great documentary on Netflix called Jiro Dreams of Sushi. And this is a man who grew up in war times and didn't have like any training, but somehow through devotion of his craft became one of the most well-known sushi chefs. And I think he's been Michelin star rated like a number of times for his shop. And it's like this little shop in like a train station, right? But the thing is that for him, creating and crafting sushi is one of those things that he keeps doing each and every day, right? Just because he got a Michelin star did not mean that was an end to his craft. And that's what I think is often really tricky about success and these metrics, is because it's easy to have these labels of certificates of like this affirmation of approval from society to say, you now are this level of approval, right? X Michelin star. It's a great example for restaurants, right? It's about as high as you can get. I think 3 Michelin stars is the highest. And then the funny thing is, though, the craft that took them there to become a 3 Michelin star, funny enough, you'll hear often about chefs who, when they lost their Michelin star, they got really, really depressed. And before I forget, actually, I talked about Jiro Dreams of Sushi, so I just want to make sure that's mentioned here. And then I won't even go into the darker side of that story, but they get super depressed and they lose sight of what made their restaurant so unique, right? And this is why I think this is such a tricky topic philosophically. It's because we see this happening all over, and regardless of profession, in that if we can actually find ourselves falling in love with process, falling in love with the craft and the impact we're creating, rather than these sort of externally defined metrics that are often, they're often arbitrary. And more than likely, even if not arbitrary, they're often in the service of someone else's values and principles that ultimately, unless you set out to explicitly align them, they often don't necessarily align with your own values. And so, I see AJ Truix here. Great documentary. Yes, definitely love Jiro Dreams of Sushi. And so, let's talk about values here, right? Values come in a lot of different forms, right? This is, when let's stick within the realm of coding. Your values as a coder often might have to do with, for example, things about having your code have reliable uptime. This might be one of your values or the service, right? Maybe it's not your code, right? Your service has reliable uptime, especially if you have things like servers. If you're releasing software, right? Software has minimal amount of bugs. These are values that you can have as developers. As content creators, we want to create content that excites us, that we think has a lot of interesting potential. And the reason I say it like this is because one of the challenges, I'll speak for myself as someone who does create content, is that it's really easy to want to follow the trends of basically to follow what's trending. What's popular? What is the buzzword? And if you're a full-time content creator, I can see why some of that needs to happen, because basically people are coming to you for the latest and greatest. But the problem with, I think, this path is that unless this style of sort of research and constantly being catching up with the latest and greatest is exciting to you, I think for a lot of people, this is actually draining. And why most people, when they see this kind of content creation, they're like, there's no way I can do that. And instead, though, if as a content creator, we can focus on the things that excite us, that we want to talk about, this is what ultimately makes content creation, in my opinion, sustainable. And it's this kind of value that makes a difference between burnout and being able to do it over time. And so this is one of the things I've tried to evolve as well, as you can see with a lot of the streams that I do in content, is that I try to be really intentional about aligning the questions I'm having in my own life, the things that I'm building and the things I'm trying to solve with the stuff that I'm sharing with you all. Because I think that's really where, in my opinion, where the message is the most valuable, is because I'm not just speaking to you arbitrarily about something that I read about because a bunch of other people are talking about it, right? An easy way, for example, a trending topic in tech right now is Web3. I could totally do a bunch of stuff around Web3 if my goal was merely to increase the amount of viewers, to get more clicks, or to somehow gain more, I don't know, fame or whatever. But this is where I have to ask myself, do these things really, do I care about these things from a success aspect, right? Don't get me wrong. If I talk about something that is actively doing harm, I will want that kind of impact that matters to me. But on the other hand, just because I don't have millions of people watching something doesn't necessarily mean that my impact isn't had at a level that matters to me. And I think that's what's really hard about this sometimes, is because the values you have don't always immediately translate to what is ultimately recognizable impact in a way that most people in society often define it by. And so I think a common example of this actually are artists who spend so many years honing their craft, right? Just drawing, doodling. And for a long time, most people are not thinking of them as some sort of world-renowned artist. But eventually, right, they come out with the one piece when they keep honing their craft that really resonates with people. And then when it does, right, it's this huge, there's a bunch of noise around this amazingness, the talent and everything. But what people forget about is that the process of following the path of, or the stepping to the beat of our own drum is so key in order to really having that sort of signature impact on the world. And so a really great example of this is, I believe it was a comic strip author that I'm actually kind of failing on the name right now, but he was talking about his path to success. And he kind of mentioned this sort of thing about how he says, I'm not the best writer in the world. I'm not the best artist in the world, nor am I the funniest person in the world. But the different things about me, right? My experiences in life, along with the little bit of doodling that I did and the writing I did, came together in a way that had a really unique impact on the world, because it was like this sort of unique combination of experiences that ultimately allowed him to create that masterpiece. And so here I see radio signal. Users are happy with the application. Application is user friendly. Ooh, perfect. Additional things. Yes, happy with user. Application is user friendly. Yep, these are great values. And so AJ Shrix here with some great stuff in the comments here. So people are tired of hearing of NFTs. But that's the funny thing though, right? It's like, that's another thing to define. Is like, what does it mean to have the attention of your audience, right? If you just want the clicks of anyone in the world, NFTs are still fairly a viral topic, right? Because if you can be like, well, I'll help you build the NFTs that'll make you like $500,000 in 6 months, a lot of people are going to click into that because it's just super, super clickbaity. However, if your goal is to target people that, this is what I was talking about though, regarding alignment of values. Because if you know who you want your audience, if you know what kind of impact you want to create along your values, a lot of these decisions that we often make kind of become a lot easier, honestly. And so AJ Shrux here with a great quote. So all overnight success takes about 10 years. And so apparently this is from Jeff Bezos. And exactly, like this has been talked about in many, many different ways. I think Malcolm Gladwell has a book about, I forgot what it was called. I think it was Tipping Point. Might have been another one. But anyways, it's been talked a lot in a lot of different pop psychology and just general ideas around the importance of craftsmanship and falling in love with process over outcome. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover here. So values here, at least to me, often help to define the kind of impact that we want. But then the other part here that I just kind of want to highlight at a high level, I think, is around the idea of alignment. Because just because you have your values, let's say you know that really well, and you know what metrics you're being like, sort of you have some high level metrics of how you're living your life, there has to be intentional effort around aligning those two things together. Because otherwise, you're basically going to end up being led around by someone else's agenda. And so this takes intentional effort, is really kind of what I want to say with this. And I think that if we get better at understanding what our values are as individuals, so we were talking about here about all the different things as software developers, right? Whether a service has reliable uptime, whether software has minimal bugs. We talked about user-friendly applications. This is where people align themselves to then the roles that they take on. Because let's say you really care about user experience, well, you might be really happy as a user experience designer versus like someone who's really cares about a reliable uptime might be in DevOps. Someone who cares a lot about making sure that a code is really security. And then if you love testing, you'll probably join a testing like framework or a company that helps you to push that agenda forward. And this is what's really nice about knowing what your values are, because then once you do, the effort it takes to align yourself becomes a lot clearer. I was about to say easier, but let's be honest, we all know that just because you know where you want to go, the journey there might still be difficult. But then if you ask me, when you know what direction you want to head to and that it's aligned with your values, that to me is worth the journey, because your success at creating impact that you can be proud of and creating a legacy that is one that you'd be happy to share with others, that others would remember you by, that is worth the effort to me. And so the next question I have here inside of my note is around this idea of success and ego. Because a lot of time I think when we think about success, understandably so, we're thinking of ourselves as individuals. It's why those metrics of success we sort of mentioned earlier is around the ideas of like money, comfort, and it's centered around the individual, because as we just talked about, right, it is about your values. But I think if we could remove the idea of success, ego specifically, from the idea of success, I think we can create greater impact that goes beyond us. Because I think that's where a lot of my sort of philosophical musing has kind of taken me to, is that there comes a point where your success as an individual, I will say, kind of caps out. Because at some point you will be able to afford, again, just like if you think about it, just like in a concept of more or less of like of infinity, if you simply just optimize for the path of money, unless you have enough money, you can eat all the nicest things in the world, you can live in the nicest places, but there eventually comes a point where you're capped out at what you're able to do for yourself. And most importantly, right, if we're thinking about our values as we've been talking about, there is a limit. At some point, you're going to go, how can I extend my impact in a way that goes beyond me as an individual? And so this is why I think a lot of people eventually get into things like mentoring, teaching, and more importantly, giving back to community. Because again, teaching and mentoring, definitely not for everyone. But when we can find ways to collaborate and add value to community, I think that is the kind of legacy that a lot of times we as individuals actually care a lot about. Because when we can see the work that we do impact people in a way that benefits them, there's something really, really gratifying about that. And so compassion and kindness is one of those things that I'd like to try to get more people thinking about when it comes to their success, in that the success of others is your own success, in the sense of like, not that like I'm talking about claiming credit, but there's something there's something intangible about knowing that you played a role in someone being able to like really like take like come into their own, like, oh, how do I say this? The analogy I think that I've seen used, I think Jason Langston from Netlify, who's my boss, had one point like mentioned like sort of like being able to be the sea that like lifts, like raises the tides for all ships, so that they can then like basically navigate out and do their thing. To me, I think there's something really, I don't want to say noble, because noble makes it sound, I don't know, there's something maybe pedantic about the idea of noble. The reason why I love the idea of removing ego from success is because if you think about it, actually, when we like, there's almost no greater impact than enabling others to embark on their own journeys to then have greater other impacts in the world. Because ultimately, at least within the realm of technology, this is ultimately scalability. Because we want the ability to say, where does my work go beyond myself? Because if we take the whole common metaphor of like teaching a person to fish versus giving them a fish, right? I think a lot of people's idea of success starts out with like, oh, I'm the person who has all the fish, and when people come to ask for me, I will give them fish, and I feel good about myself because I am feeding people. And to me, this is a very egocentric way of thinking about success. Because now we're in a realm where like everything is about you. And more importantly, if you get removed from the equation for whatever reason, now all of a sudden your impact is pretty like, it's actually really negative. Because if you think about it, if you've created a dependency on others to merely rely on you to provide those things, now you've created a linchpin effect that is honestly not healthy for like the progression of a community as a whole. But if what you can do is find ways to empower others to then also go fish, to also find ways like if they want to explore like farming or whatever, like I know the metaphor is starting to become a bit of a stretch, but you all of a sudden create a sense of community that goes way beyond you. And not only does it go beyond you, it lives beyond you. And I think that if we're talking about impact, that's the kind of impact that I think is really lasting, and the ones that, at least I'll speak for myself, that I think I really value as an individual. So, you know, we're talking about, so again, as far as notes go, right, we talk about the fact that separating ego from success is what actually allows impact to scale beyond an individual. So Pickle Light Bright. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry if I missed this, but thank you so much for stopping by. Yes, we'll be sure to chat soon. And so, okay, Radio Signal here with a great comment here. Everyone interprets success differently. You need a sense of achievement to be happy. Yeah. So this is an interesting thought here. So let's go ahead and let's unpack this a little bit. So how does the sense of achievement play into success? Okay, and so actually I am gonna credit to so let me, for this one, let me do inspired by, and then we do radio signal here. Great. Okay, this is great, right? Because achievement here, and this is, I think, why, honestly, I probably want to do like one of these a month, because I'm actually having a lot of fun, and next time I'll probably prepare like readings and stuff for people, because I think a lot of this, when it comes to like things like sense of achievement, I think radio signal is right on the money with that. Is that a lot of times the reason why we use metrics to define success and we use it to like see how we're doing is because it provides us feedback. Another way of thinking of it is that if you are, how do I put this? Let's see. If you're working on code, right? Because I'm going to assume a lot of us here are at least familiar with the concept of code, building things. You need to actually see that the thing is working, and you need to get feedback on the fact that what you're doing will eventually build to something bigger. Otherwise, you have the lack of feedback, in my opinion, will cause most people to ultimately lose motivation to continue going. And so if you think about like who would play a video game that would never tell you how you're doing, right? In the sense of like there's no feedback mechanism. And so the sense of achievement to me is actually a feedback mechanism for whether or not you are successful or not, right? So let me just, so that I think this achievement is, wow, what the heck just happened there? Achievement is a feedback mechanism that we use to help us find out whether or not we're successful. And so to unpack that a little bit, when it comes to achievement, I think if we go back one more step though, this is why I was saying, if you can figure out what your values are, you will actually figure out what that sense of achievement is. Because when your achievement is something sort of like, to connect to the last question we were talking about regarding like sort of egocentrism, like basically when it's centered around your ego. And again, there's nothing wrong with this inherently. It's like a lot of things, it's when it's taken to extreme or taken out of context from everything else. Because what I'm trying to say here, I'm not saying you shouldn't do anything for yourself, right? Because some might argue, well, if I create art, like, isn't that just for my own enjoyment? Like, I don't need to like paint a mural every single time, because what if it's just for me? I'm not like, and so to be clear, it's not so much that ego is like inherent bad when it comes to the discussion of achievement and success. It's more so that I want people to intentionally sort of be aware of those things. And to more importantly, I think the reason why I talked about it and sort of like the other side of it, as far as recognizing that our achievements and success can also be played out in the form of others' achievement and success, is this very idea that when we can broaden our horizon when it comes to these things, I think it gives us a lot more options and honestly mental bandwidth to keep exploring new things. Because on the other hand, if you spend all your time trying to like be the tide that lifts others, in the analogy I sort of mentioned earlier, an example for myself might be like, as someone who's active in open source, I could spend all of my time in forums, in Twitter, just trying to answer everyone's question. But at some point, right, and this would be very altruistic, right? It would be very like, oh, I'm helping others. And so based on like theories I just proposed, wouldn't this be like a sense of achievement? Because every time you solve someone's problem, this is like you have validated your impact on the world. But at the same time, right, like I said, it's all about like learning to have that push and play, or not push and play. Push and play is totally wrong. Push and pull between things, right? Understanding when trade-offs come into play, when you should be filling your own cup as far as like your own mental energy, your enthusiasm for things, with what you're doing for the rest of the world. Because again, like rest, and honestly, that's a whole topic of itself as far as personal care and recovery. But anyhow, with that said, okay, so let's recap. So I'm gonna switch on over back to the camera. All right. Well, it's been quite a journey today. We've talked a lot about different concepts regarding the relationship between metrics and success. But I hope that at least, you know, a lot of people here in the chat, loving that we have a lot of alignment, right, in terms of the way we think, and a willingness to question things that oftentimes we take for granted, like we often take for granted as like someone else defined for us. And so being able to be intentional about the things that we decide to do, about the values we care about, and the communities we choose to be a part of, that I think ultimately, I think that that's at the core of what a lot of, I'll call it like positive productivity is around, rather than toxic productivity, which honestly is, we basically kind of touched on, which is the idea that like when you're productive for the sake of being productive for the wrong metrics, for the wrong values, it's not ultimately a good thing. I think this is why people get the sense of like, yeah, I was busy, but wasn't a good kind of busy, right? And so there's also like a term that you might want to look up at some point is the idea around like good tired and bad tired, right? That there are days when like you've spent all your efforts trying to fight for someone else's vision, someone else's dreams, solve someone else's problems, and you went to bed feeling just exhausted and just like the day was wasted. But in the days that you're fighting your own battles in a way that aligns with your values, even if it's a day that you lost, right? It's a day where you did not produce a single feature. You were wrestling with a bug in an app that you were building, but it was like for the things you cared about and for the things you wanted for the people around you that mattered, like that you will go to sleep like a happy camper because all those things align. And so for me, oftentimes productivity is talked about in a work sense, but I do think it ties a lot more into our own personal fulfillment. And I'd love to see us as a community, as a society, start to move ourselves away from productivity being all about work and these metrics that aren't necessarily aligned with our own values. So, with that said, that is a wrap for today. As always, if you have any questions, be sure to drop a comment below, and all the resources that we talked about today will be below in the show notes. So again, it's been really fun, and thanks everyone for hanging out in the chat and chiming in. It's been great having all of your feedback. So I'll talk to you all later. Bye-bye.